It is a great honor of ours from the Center for Security and Intelligence Defense Studies, as well as the Clean Security Defense Network, to welcome you all here today to hear about Arctic security and the challenges faced by common friends from the north towards our increasingly concerned neighbors to the east, or concerning, I should say. So what I'd like to do is first acknowledge that this is taking place on the unceded Algonquin territory that's home to the Nationality Nation, and that we're going to have the ambassador from Norway, Ambassador Petersson, introduce our speaker, and then we'll have a short panel, and then we'll hopefully have time for some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to Carleton and to NAADSN for being partner of the Royal Norwegian Embassy and today's event. We're honored to have in Ottawa today our State Secretary, Eivind Vad Petersson, who is Youth Trust State Secretary and Deputy Minister, which means that he is the number 2 in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs politician from the Norwegian Labour Party, and responsible for relations with the government and security politics, among a lot of other things as well. Like discussions here today in parts, and coming here to Carleton today to about Arctic, which is a field that Norway can have very much share and one of the hottest topics, to use that term, that we can discuss together both in public and also. So I'm sure we'll have a good and fruitful discussion today. Thank you all for being here, and stay safe.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you again for inviting me to Carleton University and to this event to share some Norwegian perspectives of the Arctic. I'm very happy to be here and to discuss issues which are at the core of our foreign policy. I must admit, pleasure also to be here in Ottawa. Although yesterday, I must admit, it didn't feel like an Arctic November being here. Today, it's more familiar with the cold wind and then more November weather in the Arctic than you're used to. Norway and Canada are close allies. As Arctic states, we share many of the same interests and perspectives on the future of Arctic governance and development. The Arctic has in many ways long been spared geopolitical tensions. Russia's brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine marked a turning point for European security and for multilateral cooperation in general, and of course also for the Arctic. For Norway, sharing a border with Russia, such a devastating attack has had profound and immediate impact on our foreign policy and security policy. The key elements of Norway's Arctic policy remain the same, however. International cooperation, sustainable development, military and allied presence in the north, combating climate change, and accelerating the green transition. And I will return to these points a bit later. It is hard to comprehend the suffering that Russia's brutal war of aggression has inflicted on the Ukrainian people. Incredible and numerous reports of war crimes are shocking. Norway will continue to provide substantial military, economic, and humanitarian support for Ukraine for as long as necessary. Norwegian support for Ukraine so far amounts to approximately 15 billion Norwegian kroners, or $1.5 billion US dollars. 2/3 civilian, a third military support. The consequences of this war reach far beyond Ukraine. Europe is currently facing the most serious security crisis since World War II. And with global food and energy prices rising, we see once again that it is the most vulnerable among us who will bear the highest cost. The war has ushered in a new period of instability. Russia's complete disregard for international law, for human rights, and democratic principles undermines multilateral cooperation in general. This also affects cooperation and stability in the Arctic. It is now we must ask ourselves, what kind of Arctic do we really want to have? For Norway, the answer is simple. We want a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Arctic. The path forward is a bit more complicated, but I will mention the key components here today. So to put it in slogan terms, our North low tension still remains our ambition and our policy goal. Over the last years, Russia has modernized and developed its military. Russia conducts regular exercises in the waters just off the Norwegian coast. Substantial parts of the Russian nuclear arsenal are located just across the Norwegian land border with Russia. We do not observe any major changes in the Russian force posture in the Highlands, except for considerable depletion of their land forces due to the war in Ukraine. It remains to be seen if there will be any substantial Russian adjustments in our region with the new Nordic members in NATO. So far, we note that Russian reactions to the Swedish and Finnish NATO applications have been rather limited. Finnish and Swedish NATO membership will strengthen NATO and make the Nordic region more secure. We are supporting our neighbors in their accession in any way we can. Finland's and Sweden's NATO accession also paves the way for increased Nordic cooperation on defense and security policy, as well as in many other areas. Russia's war on Ukraine emphasizes the importance, from a security perspective, of a strong and robust northern Norway. We are now strengthening our defense and facilitating allied presence and training in our northern regions. Norway has now, in the recent months, become the biggest supplier of oil and gas to the rest of Europe. Therefore, we are also increasing military presence around offshore installations and other critical infrastructure in Norway. We take very seriously Norway's role as a credible supplier of gas to Europe. And we are strengthening security at our border, our land border with Russia as well. Norway and Canada cooperate closely on Arctic-related issues in NATO. Our Arctic policy has been and continues to be defined by our relationship with Russia. Norwegian governments have facilitated cooperation and exchanges across the border for decades. Well-functioning cooperation with Russia in the north has been in our national interest. We cannot cooperate normally, however, with the current political regime in Russia. After February 24th, we have downscaled our bilateral cooperation to a bare minimum. Unity among allies and partners remains crucial for standing up against Russia's military aggression. We have, with some very minor exceptions, aligned with all consecutive rounds of EU sanctions. The fundamental and necessary change of policy has had big implications for many Norwegian communities, businesses and research institutions in the north that have worked closely with Russian counterparts for decades. However, Norway cannot change our geography. We share a border with Russia on land and at sea. It is necessary to maintain some contacts in order to minimize risks of misunderstandings and unintended escalation. We aim to be a predictable and responsible neighbor. 9% of Norway's population resides above the Arctic Circle. That's roughly 500,000 people. Investing in the people living and working in the north is a crucial investment in Norway's security. We want to make sure our northern regions are attractive places to live, work, study, raise families, and continue the traditions and way of life of the Sami people. Sustainable economic growth, job creation, education, research, and opportunities for the young generation is therefore necessary. We see a population decline in certain parts of the Norwegian Arctic, and this is a concern. The government is working actively to reverse this trend. To be specific, in the recent national budget for next year, the government has proposed that kindergarten should be free of charge for all families living in the northernmost part of Norway, as an incentive for young families to both settle and stay in our northernmost regions. Indigenous issues are a priority in Norway's Arctic policy. Sami culture is a valuable part of our national historical heritage. Indigenous peoples have a right to be consulted in matters that could affect them directly. The Sami therefore have their own parliament, the Sameting. Indigenous groups also participate actively in the Arctic Council, the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, and in the Barents Regional Council. While Canada and Norway's Arctic regions are quite different. I think we nonetheless share many of the same concerns, and as Arctic states, we have a responsibility towards the people living in the Arctic. Going forward, we must find the right balance between protection and development. Because climate change is affecting communities across the Arctic at an alarming pace. Most of the pollution and greenhouse gas emissions are happening mainly elsewhere in the world. This constitutes a threat not only to Arctic climate, environment, and biological diversity, but also the traditional way of life and of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. To understand how the Arctic is affected by climate change and to mitigate the consequences will require stable, long-term, and ambitious investments in science and research. We are seeing the development of world-leading research environments and technology hubs in the Arctic, and we encourage this. We must utilize the green shift and further strengthen infrastructure and services in the north. Our hope is that this will not only contribute to combating climate change, but also to serve as the foundation for creating sustainable livelihoods in the north. It requires a bottoms-up approach. All stakeholders, including indigenous peoples, must take part in the process. I believe that the answer to the challenges the Arctic faces will come from the Arctic as well. Common challenges continue to require common approaches. The Arctic, broadly speaking, is a well-regulated region. There is a comprehensive legal framework in place, and the Arctic states have established effective fora for discussing Arctic issues. Being here in Ottawa, it is of course only natural to say a few words also about the Arctic Council. Since the signing of the Ottawa Declaration in 1996, the Council has been the leading forum and mechanism to address issues of common concern across Arctic states. Following Russia's full-blown invasion of Ukraine, all work in the Council was put on pause back in March. It was simply not possible to continue normal work under a Russian chairmanship. However, the cross-border challenges in the Arctic, such as climate change, will not disappear and must be dealt with. Norway continues to plan for our upcoming chairship of the Arctic Council, which we will hold from 2023 to 2025. We are encouraged by the fact that the Arctic Council projects not involving Russia have now been able to resume. Moving forward, our priority will be to continue the important work of the Arctic Council that so successfully has contributed to global scientific knowledge, sustainable resource management, and the well-being of the people living in the Arctic. As an Arctic state, Russia has a natural place in the Arctic Council, but with the current Russian regime, business as usual is no longer possible. We will continue to seek out the way forward for Arctic cooperation, naturally in close coordination with our friends and allies in Canada and the US and the other Nordic countries. International interest for the Arctic has been increasing for many years, and there has not been less interest after the 24th of February. Climate change, the region's vast natural resources, research cooperation, developments in green technologies and sustainable development, and the Arctic's strategic location are key drivers. In uncertain times like now, it is more important than ever that partners and allies work closely together to find constructive solutions. From the Norwegian side, we look forward to continuing and strengthening the close Arctic relations we enjoy with Canada. I look forward to the further discussions here today. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now we'll have Whitney Lackenbauer, who is bar none the Canadian expert in all things to the north.
There are many Northerners who know much more than I do about their homeland, but thank you.
You're the expert from the south on the things to the north. Let me put it that way. He is the director of the North American and Arctic Security and Defense Network. He is also a very valued member of the CDSN, and so you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, State Secretary, for those opening comments. We have a very distinguished group of audience members here, but also online. Many of my colleagues, some of whom know much more than I do about aspects of Arctic security and Arctic affairs, as well as a Norwegian colleague, Andreas Dostog and Alish Quinn, who's a journalist who works on Arctic issues and very, very knowledgeable. So I'm not going to take much time, but maybe as an opening question, I'll pick up where you left off. And at this particular moment in time, we see great power competition dominating a lot of headlines, strategic competition, if we want to be more inclusive than just the big three. How much space do you see in the Arctic for modest-sized but influential powers like Norway and Canada to influence regional security dynamics and dialogue? And then can you suggest certain ways that practical steps that Canada and Norway can undertake to enhance our security cooperation?
Well, there are a number of things that we can and should do together. I mean, we are founding members of NATO. In the sense, NATO is the most successful defensive alliance in the history of mankind. In the sense that we have successfully maintained to keep the peace in Europe. And at least from the Norwegian side, the fact that we are a NATO ally is an important pillar of our Arctic High North strategy as well, in the sense that the predictability and the security that our NATO membership provides has been a platform for also being able to do other things, non-security wise. Let me bring up the Arctic Council again. I would argue, to the extent that it has been a success after the Ottawa Declaration was signed not far from here, 1996. And to the extent that it actually has been a success, which I would argue that it largely has been, one important reason for that success is that the hard security issues have been handled elsewhere. But nonetheless, has opened up a room to be able to do much together. Let me also add, like it makes no sense to refer to Canada as a small country, the second biggest one in the world. But there are other more populous nations on the planet. But the simple fact of our geographical location gives us role responsibility in the Arctic. I mentioned it's a well-regulated region. These are national territories. There's an Arctic Sea, but we have the law on the sea. It's actually not as complicated or unregulated as some people tend to believe or argue. But on that basis, we certainly have much to contribute, and we have a responsibility to cooperate on the Arctic issues that cross our borders.
Perhaps I'll ask one more question and then invite members of our panel online to also jump in with comments or questions. Historically, Canada has been a provider or a reassurer, bolster of high Northern European security through the Canadian Air Sea Transportable Brigade Group, 1970s through to the early 1990s. In turn, certainly Norway has participated, been observers in various exercises in the North American Arctic. I wonder from a Norwegian standpoint, if you can share any insights on the importance of those exchanges and any dialogue you're having about going forward to really enhance that connectedness between North American Arctic security, which is often treated quite apart from Northern European Arctic security, and what opportunity space you see for our respective countries to support one another.
Well, I mean, one approach is that our military plans are now being priced in the sense that Sweden and Finland are now joining NATO, which is a great and a good thing. But it also means that we military planners will be busy making their plans, including for scenarios where there's a need for reinforcing the Scandinavian Peninsula. Historically, during the Cold War, Canada actually had an important role to play in that kind of scenario. We would very much like to bring that back up in some sense. That's of course up to the Canadian and Norwegian officials and our NATO colleagues to discuss, but let me just put it that way. It's to do military activity in Arctic conditions is not for everyone. We take our part of the responsibility for sharing our experiences and our know-how. At least our two countries have in common that this is we know how it's done, which is a good starting point. And just to give you another angle on it, our British friends have practice where they send in the Royal Air Force, every single helicopter pilot has to stop by and spend some time in Northern Norway. Simply because if you manage to fly a helicopter in the dark, cold northern Norwegian winters, you can fly a helicopter anywhere in the world. Which is in a sense applied to all kind of civilian use, in the sense that if you manage to develop a drone that can operate in Earth conditions, it's a drone that can operate well anywhere. In terms of our militaries, the fact that we know these surroundings and how to operate, is a reason that we've been more together, as we have also done in the past.
Very well, thank you. As Canada's offered to be the host nation for the NATO Center of Excellence on Climate Security, beginning next year, I think we also have a lot to learn from Norway and your expertise in terms of the host nation for the NATO Center of Excellence in cold weather operations, and how that's been so valuable for the entire alliance, and being able to learn from a lot of the lessons and to share lessons. I open it up. Heather Exner-Pirro, please, a colleague currently at the Wilson Center and a expert Arctic consultant and Northern consultant based in Calgary, near Calgary, Bragg Creek.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Whitney?
Yes, loud and clear. Thanks, Heather.
Great. Well, thanks so much for your presentation. My question is about the Arctic Council. I wish you the best of luck with your chairmanship. My understanding is that there's no intention to formally change to an A7 or just the Ottawa Declaration. And so my question is, what is the diplomatic strategy to keep Russia out under the Ottawa Declaration, under the rules of procedure? The Arctic Council is 8 members, and there are no procedures to eliminate a member. And so any chairmanship that the Norwegians have, I guess, would the Russians would be entitled to attend the meetings. And so is the strategy to ask them not to come? And what happens if they decide to come anyways?
Well, that's those kind of questions are what diplomats are for.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear your clever solution.
I refer to myself as a recovering diplomat. I spent a decade in the foreign service before shifting to politics, but now I'm sort of back in a sort of merged political diplomatic role. Let me approach it in this way, simply stating from the Norwegian side, we believe it's in our national interest that the Arctic Council survives and remains the primary body for handling cross-border issues in the Arctic. Consultations are ongoing on the best way forward. According to the schedule, we will take over the chairship during the spring next year. We are prepared to do so. And again, it is our intention that the Arctic Council, as founded according to the Ottawa Declaration, continues to exist. It can obviously not continue as before. For example, having ministerial meetings in the same format that we've been doing them over the past 2-3 decades is not on the cards in the foreseeable future. However, and I reiterate, we believe it's in our national interest, and for that sake, the national interest of other Arctic countries as well, that the Council survives. And we are busy in discussions on how best to achieve that goal.
Well, thanks, Dr. Exner-Pirro. I think that's a big challenge as well. I mean, I think over the last year, we've been able to say that, in fact, putting a pause has meant that the like-minded Arctic states have chosen to opt out of certain things. I think there is that challenge not only about the actual handover and what form that may take, but also going forward, what that looks like to maintain the integrity of this high-level forum, and something that even the Americans in their, I shouldn't say even the Americans, the United States in their recent Arctic policy still remains, right, the sort of core regional body for cooperation and dialogue. I now invite Andrea Chiron, who's one of the co-leads of the North American Arctic Defense and Security Network and director of the Center for Defense Studies at the University of Manitoba.
Thanks very much. Sorry, my camera isn't working, but I'm going to follow along further the question that Heather provided. We had the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable hosted by US Northcom and Norway in Fairbanks, Alaska in May. And then Canada hosted the Arctic Chief of Defense Staff. We're saying that we don't want an A7 versus Russian split, except for that we continue to see the A7 finding ways to meet together to discuss Arctic issues without Russia. How do we square that circle?
Well, That one, although squaring circles generally do not tend to be that easy, I actually find quite easy in the sense that the Arctic Council deliberately deal with issues not generally categorized as hard security. And to the extent that the Arctic Council has been excellent over the past 2-3 decades, and I would argue that it has to consider them actually been a success. I would also argue that one important reason for that success has been that we have chosen to keep the hard security military issues outside the remits of that council. So I would take issue with the premise of the question. I don't really think there's a circle to be squared. From our point of view, we very much appreciate the different forms that we have within the chiefs of defense or the Coast Guard. Also, bearing in mind that very soon the Arctic 7 will be the NATO Arctic 7 as well, with Sweden and Finland becoming full members of NATO. NATO is a collective security organization, but the way it works, obviously, the Arctic nations will have a responsibility for coordinating, sharing, and making suggestions for the rest of the alliance. That's perfectly natural and the way it should go about. That's for the Arctic Council. We believe it should continue to focus on hard security issues. One example, I mentioned climate change. It's a well-known fact that climate change is happening fastest. Global warming is at its strongest in the Arctic. To be able to continue to share data, to really understand the details of the changes happening for us. It's something that the Arctic Council has been able to facilitate, and we hope that we can continue to do so.
Great, thanks. I'm really happy to open it up to the floor in just a moment, but maybe one final question here. We've learned in recent months about gas leaks from the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea, suspicious drone observations, threat to the petroleum industry's infrastructure in the high north, the cutting of sea cables, for example. You referenced before Norway taking steps to increase preparedness and to strengthen controls over critical infrastructure. I wonder if you can maybe share a little bit more with us about what that looks like within an alliance context, or if there are other aspects of security that maybe you've identified and your team has identified that are things that we're not maybe thinking about as much as we might looking forward or looking towards the future.
No, I think I briefly mentioned the simple fact that Norway is now the biggest oil and gas supplier to the rest of Europe, which is a responsibility that we take very seriously. High prices and possibly a challenging winter coming for the rest of Europe. We have considerable infrastructure in the North Sea as well, 8,800 kilometers of pipelines. Of course, we took very notice what happened in the Baltic Sea to the Nord Stream pipelines. So that's both of them. This number of differences, for example, the pipelines were essentially Russian in the sense that they were majority controlled by Gazprom. All pipelines, the Norwegian continental shelf and further down in the Norwegian Sea are fully owned by Gazprom and a state-owned controlled company for infrastructure. So there's no doubt that this is Norwegian infrastructure. We have excellent relations with our NATO allies and partners in the region. But in a sense, also our customers for our exports. And it's obviously in their security interest, energy security interest, to be precise, that stability prevails, and we are the reliable supplier that we've been able to be. And that's a question of what we do in the open, increase maritime activity, in-force activity, both sea and plan, and also measures that are maybe not that obvious to the public. It's important for me also to say that although the Norwegian Armed Forces officially will the public with the fact that we move to a higher level of readiness, and acknowledging the fact that Europe finds itself in the most serious security situation since the end of the Second World War, we do not see or perceive a direct threat to Norway. Nonetheless, the circumstances in our region are such that a number of measures have been necessary.
Great. I certainly open it up to the floor if anybody has a question or a comment. Please.
Thank you. Jacob with my EU delegation here in Canada. I'd like to follow up a little bit. I mean, you started about this, but I would like to know how you perceive now the real kinetic threats in the Arctic region or in the north. Before, for many years, we had this tendency to be wondering in scenarios what Russia may theoretically do. There was this maybe there is still a very interesting Norwegian series called Occupied. So we had many ideas what may happen. Not many people thought that actually the Russian army with its full tank will go into the mud of the Zaporizhzhia. So how, after seeing more or less what they're capable of and what they're not capable of, how do you assess now what is the real security threat in the high Arctic?
Well, I'd like to start by repeating the observation when it comes to our infrastructure, and that's an observation that also applies to Norwegian security in general, in the sense that we do not perceive or see any specific threat to Norwegian territory or national security. However, of course, we find ourselves in a changed security environment, and in a sense, hypotheticals are very useful for scenario planning, and I can share with you that we inside government have been busy with scenarios and contingencies that we very short time ago did not care that much about, but it's become necessary to make sure we are ready for the unpredictable. Because as you mentioned, full-blown war in Europe, like the one we're seeing now in the Ukraine, came as a surprise. We will go years back. We find security and then safety in the fact that we, together with Canada, we're founding members of NATO. We've been able to develop also a specific relationship with key allies. We don't have any basis of our NATO allies in Norway or in Norwegian territory. It's a national decision that we have made solely on our own behalf. But our allies come to train and exercise in Norway often. It's a good thing, and we hope that they will continue to do so, including Canadian troops that might not be that shocked with the Norwegian military conditions as, for example, some U.S. Marines from some of the southern states in the U.S. have been coming to Norway to train. But coming back to the start of my reply, while the security environment most certainly has changed, we do not perceive or see any specific threat to Norwegian national security.
If I may build off that from a Canadian standpoint, maybe a North American standpoint, I mean, sometimes we communicate our strategic message with Russia differently than European nations do or neighbors do. Norway's 2021 Arctic policy states that maintaining a balance between deterrence and reassurance vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia has been a key component of Norway's security policy for decades. Norway's defense and deterrent policy is based on the maintenance of an effective national defense and the guarantee of allied reinforcements in the event of war or crisis. So you were talking in your comments today about the importance of predictability and being a responsible neighbor. Are there insights for maybe North Americans like myself about what types of messaging that involves, or what types of forms that reassurance may take while at the same time making sure that we're not undermining our very strong principled stand vis-a-vis this heinous further invasion of Ukraine?
Well, our policy to a very large extent was defined by our geographical location. Simple fact I mentioned that Soviet Union, now Russia, has the strategic nuclear forces 50 kilometers away from our border. But you mentioned two key words, the combination of deterrence and reassurance. That has been sort of mainstay of our security policy for decades going back. Maybe one observation is that in the circumstances we find ourselves in, to the extent that we can also do reassurance, it has more to do with how we set up deterrence. Not sort of complete different baskets of measures. Meaning, for example, that our activity, everything that we do, is predictable. Also making sure that they are defensive measures. We know we not pose a threat to anyone or anywhere. Is that we have a military presence? It's for defensive purposes.
I think that's key. In North America, we've started to adopt the language of integrated deterrence. If I'm listening well, in the Nordic countries, it's often framed as comprehensive deterrence as a similar approach. But thinking about all those different integration of the different tools that we have working across our alliances, and in some ways, as the questions are suggesting, seeing defense threats and kinetic military threats as one piece, but increasingly the space being complex as we're looking at non-kinetic threats or non-traditional domains of threats having to be dealt with together. I'll turn the next question over to Elise Quinn.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, nice to see you. I was wondering if you could talk us through just a little bit about how Norway is evaluating the pause on climate research, or how it's approaching those evaluations. And from Norway's point of view, how long can these pauses on Arctic climate research go on before it becomes a security issue for Arctic nations?
Well, I think I briefly touched by it when addressing how we see the Arctic Council going forward, the work of different sub-bodies and working groups of the Arctic Council. We are the incoming chair of the Arctic Council, and as the role of the chair is to facilitate and convene historically, but it also is to consider responsibility to find consensus for a way forward. So I might be a bit, as an incoming chair, that's a responsibility we take seriously. And I mentioned the overarching goal that we want the Arctic Council to survive and remain the primary body for dealing with Arctic issues. And almost first on my list is what you referred to, the simple fact that for using big words, but for mankind, climate change, it's a possible, it's a generational challenge, and it's happening fastest in the Arctic. So for us to be able to understand it, it is crucial that we manage to be able to share climate data and observations with a full and correct picture of what's actually happening. Also bear in mind that this is of course an important meeting, because an important meeting taking place in Egypt, where we have of climate change. What's happening in the Arctic, warming up, literally melting, is important for the whole world.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lish. So I guess a question you mentioned as well in your comments about some of the differences between the realities of the physical considerations of the Norwegian Arctic compared to the Canadian Arctic. And again, recognizing sometimes the lack of familiarity with Canadian audiences, I wonder if you could reflect on some of the differences. In essence, we often focus, as we naturally do, on the common areas. Are there some areas of difference or issues where our realities are different, and in essence, it might not be it's not that we wouldn't cooperate or we get in each other's way, but we just may not have a common natural commonality of interest.
Maybe just looking at population structure, I mentioned it. I mean, roughly 500,000 people, 10% of our population. Tromsø, one of our bigger cities, is an entire Arctic city, which makes a difference. How we approach the distances of these countries are just vast. I take some time to travel also by plane from the south of Norway to the furthest northeastern part of Norway. But that actually makes a difference. The fact that much bigger parts of our population have been exposed to life in the Arctic and the high north. But I mean, maybe the biggest difference possibly is the Gulf Stream. Yes. I spent my childhood in this region, taken as the border town, just 7 kilometers away from what was then in the late 1980s, the border between NATO and Southern Russia, the only border between them. And of course, it was pitch dark for 2 months, winter, and there was midnight sun for roughly 2 months. It was cold, but the harbor was always ice-free, and then people I met looking at the globe, believe me, but of course having consequences for the climate with the fact that the water is fairly warm and also for living conditions, although it can be harsh in other areas as well.
Well, I know, and Andreas Dosthagen, who's joining us from Oslo from Fridtjof Nansen Institute, will correct me if I wasn't listening well in Longyearbyen a few weeks ago. Many of us are familiar with Svalbard, which is a part of Norwegian sovereign territory. Article 1 is very clear on that, of the Spitsbergen Treaty, 1925, Svalbard Treaty, as we usually refer to it now. But it also has quite unique provisions regarding the citizens of other states having certain rights to work and do certain types of activities on this sovereign Norwegian territory. Obviously, historically, and at present, there's quite a sizable Russian presence on Svalbard. I wondered if you had anything you could share about how that relationship is being managed, or whether that poses any particular wrinkles in the last 8 to 9 months.
Well, first and foremost, Svalbard is part of Norway, is Norwegian territory. So thank you so much for being here on that. And there's an important distinction that we made as well. But yes, the treaty provides rights for citizens of other states. It does not provide rights for other states, other countries. And there are indeed historical Russian settlement, Svalbard, Bartsburg, coal mining community. The fascinating fact that the majority of the population of this small mining country, like the Ukrainian, originating from the Donbass area, which has been the coal district of Ukraine, and now, of course, battered by war conflict. It is not the intention of the Norwegian government to block or pick this settlement out from Svalbard, according to Svalbard Treaty. Citizens have the right to have this activity. We have, as I mentioned, also introduced European sanctions on Russia as a consequence of the news war against Ukraine. We have made some minor adjustments when it comes to Svalbard, and this is very specific. I mean, there's across Europe a ban on the Russian air travel. We have made a small exception between this settlement of Bartsburg. Russian helicopters are allowed to fly between this settlement and Longyearbyen, which is the biggest settlement of Svalbard. So there's an airport and also a small hospital. Just to be very precise, we made the exception for health and safety reasons, that we can actually access a small hospital and also the airport. It is not friction-free, but we're going to go to find solutions to the challenges that have come up, as we have been for the Northern Assembly that is already.
And Ryan Dean, who's in the audience here, could speak in great detail to Canada's involvement in evacuating Barentsburg and Longyearbyen and Norwegian citizens and Russian citizens during the Second World War. And that's Canada, one of Canada's connections to Svalbard, who's written about it extensively. Wonder, I see that there's quite a few chat comments.
We also have a question.
Oh, please. So anybody who's on screen who would like to ask a question, we can't see the chat. So please feel free just to put up your hand and we're happy to invite you into the conversation.
And Mark?
Hi, PhD student here. Pick up the differences that Dr. Lackenbauer was speaking to. You stressed the importance in your talk of stakeholder engagement as part of the sort of defense process. But there's a notable difference in approach in the Nordic context or the Canadian context, in the sense that the Nordic countries are approaching defense through a lens of total defense. Canada, we're looking to integrate, haven't gotten there just yet. So I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the lessons learned working closely with some people and the lessons learned or the insights gained from approaching defense through this more robust, participatory and integrated fashion.
Well, I think to the extent there's a Nordic concept of total defense, also based on certain differences between our countries, I would presume that it's primarily a reaction to historical and geographical realities that we found ourselves in the location we did during the Cold War, and with the population size that we had, that the population density that we had, meant that all resources must be mobilized. I mean, part of the changes after the fall of Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Of course, this came more and more in the background. Let's be honest, but it was never really forgotten, and it's I think the concepts that have proved to be mobilizable, so to speak. I don't think that's an English word. It's been able to be brought up again. And that's for the Sami people as well. I mean, it's just one way of looking at it in a time of hybrid threats. It's very, very important to have a local population that really know local area, know who belongs and what's normal and what's not so normal and what's not possibly be a threat. Just very, very simply put. But that also, of course, relies on trust between the local population and the relevant services. That cannot be taken for given, that has been earned from the government and from the services side. We believe we have a pretty good track record over the decades to be able to make use of society's resources. Total, it's a necessity, but also mobilize defense with
Great, thanks. Excellent response, and I think an excellent question as well. And I think it almost invites comparison. Those social scientists in the room interested in looking at models like the Canadian Ranger Organization and the Canadian Armed Forces, and doing comparisons with Norwegian model and other Nordic models of figuring out ways of doing that total defense and connecting with that real deep subject matter expertise in local areas. Karen Everett, please. Karen is at University of Laval.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you for your talk today. And I'm just wondering if you see any differences between NORAD and NATO's approaches to security in the Arctic, and if so, how any differences can be navigated moving forward.
I said before, please feel free to ask me anything, but then I also have to be honest and say that think that question is better posed to Canadian or for that matter the US colleagues, because I must admit, I mean, from our point of view, we know the NORAD, but the details are probably better by someone else. From a Norwegian perspective, simply put, I mean, the entirety of our territory, and of Canada's territory and the US territory, are covered by Article 5 of NATO. So, of course, it's the responsibility also of NATO and NATO plans to be able to defend the entirety of our territories. While the geography of North America, of course, makes certain specific measures necessary. Once again, I leave it to other experts able to address the exact interaction between our
Well, I think, State Secretary, if I may, building off of what you're suggesting, I've been shocked, Karen, at how much, when we look at NORAD modernization, emphasis on domain awareness, sort of the detection piece of the detect, deter, defend, defeat sort of equation has commonalities with what's going on within the Nordic security space as well. The importance on not only being able to bring in the information, but then being able to fuse the information and having the command and control to inform decision making. So what the Americans refer to as decision superiority is enabled. And I think what I'm reading in the Nordic space, to me, really resembles a lot of what's going on. Obviously, a different construct in North America with our binational command, which is different than the Nordic construct, but that there probably is space eventually to think about ways that we can better harmonize or synchronize our efforts in sort of informing this Arctic security domain awareness more broadly. So I think it's a really good question and a really good, also an interesting space for those of you who are digging in and interested in exploring these issues to think about creative ways of maybe working together differently than we have in the past to meet these emerging challenges and threats. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'd like to feedback that question real quick. I'm Johnny Coast Guard. I'm from the US Embassy. Where does Norway, how does Norway keep other partners? A lot of NORAD. In NORAD investments, really an investment in NATO, northwest periphery of NATO. So we know that Canada is underperforming their goals for expenditures. What does Norway see other countries as far as what they're contributing to the alliance under their partnership? What was that? Another question.
No, let me answer first by stating that our contributions as allies to the alliance go way beyond just a simple snapshot of a percentage of GDP, although it's an indicator that we have agreed on and a pledge that we made collectively back in Cardiff 8 years ago. And much has changed since, because the security situation has changed. And Norway and many other European countries have made substantial increases to our defense spending. But once again, the way we contribute to the alliance comes in many forms. I mean, just defense spending is complicated spending. It has smart defense spending, and it can have not so smart defense spending. And we've been happy to be able to cooperate with Canada on issues of concern, and I'm looking forward to able to work together. That we know that the ally that we have the closest connections and cooperation with is of course American friends. While we are very much looking forward for that to continue to be the case, having these linkages bilaterally within the below, so to speak, the NATO umbrella is a good thing, and it also enhances the alliance as such. But then, again, we respect our commitments and our pledges. We believe every alliance should
according to also to Article 3 of the treaty, when it comes to the commitments we have to take primary responsibility for our national defense.
We have time for one last question. Yes.
Yes, I'm Miles Brown, a first-year student at Carleton. So in the midst of the building tension, like lead up to the war in Ukraine, we saw a progressive Russian naval presence in just off the coast of Ireland. And I was just wondering, like, if at all, how might NATO be involved in the protection of, like, in situations like these with some of NATO's Norway's close allies, such as Iceland, who doesn't not necessarily have the militaristic measures to protect themselves in these sorts of situations. So would they, through whether economic or militaristic measures, how might Norway be involved in this sort of thing?
Well, you mentioned Ireland, which is of course a very good friend of, I think, both Canada and Norway, but is not a member of NATO. And our Irish friends should speak for themselves, but my current impression is that episode was a bit of a wake-up call for the Irish as well. Having trusted the old colonial power to their east, but take care of the territorial security issues. They will adjust their policy as they see fit. But just looking at the map, what the maritime domain and the North Atlantic crucial for our security. And very happy to be able to cooperate as closely as we do with the Americans, US Navy, Coast Guard, Marine Corps. But then, not ranking our allies, I think when it comes to the maritime domain, just looking at the map, it's British friends that of course have a strong maritime tradition, and that we are doing increasingly more together with. And there's also the question of getting into the dynamics of NATO and the defense planning. There are finding ourselves in a new security environment. Different plans are being drawn up. Mission and responsibility for different theaters, several regions of alliances, territory are being drawn up now as well. We are very happy with the fact that there will be a new, or not new, but an enhanced military command in Norfolk, also covering North Atlantic and our region. What we're able to do together under that umbrella will be crucial for maintaining stability in the maritime domain, also in our part of the world, including outside our neutral alliance, but our non-aligned state, they should serve themselves, but our mission.
Well, thanks. I think for those of you who are students, for example, if you're looking at potential topics, I'm putting on my historian hat now, looking back to the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, EUIT gap that we sometimes talk about, but I like it best when it adds on the -N, because Norway is a part of that access when we think about the connections between the European Arctic and the North Atlantic, and thinking about reflections on what that means now in the 2020s. And maybe there is some space to go back and reflect on what we were thinking back in the 1970s and 80s. And remembering that that doesn't necessarily mean that it should look the same today, but seeking some inspiration and seeing how this was always a point of connection between Canada and Norway as well, that shared commitment to the North Atlantic, the core of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So thanks very much, State Secretary Steve, over to you for wrap up.
I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I really appreciate the Norwegian Embassy for providing us with this opportunity. I want to thank the State Secretary for his comments and his insights. And I want to thank my staff from the CDSN/CSIDS for putting this together. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to more conversations about on the Arctic. It's not going away anytime too soon, so we need to have this conversation for some time to come. Thank you very much.